Welcome to this session on surf music and the Beach Boys. We're going to be exploring various topics in this discussion. One is just a sort of obvious question. How does a sport, any sport, deserve a kind of music of its own? Or deserves not even the right word. How is it that they correlate the music and the sport? We'll also be interested in the Beach Boys, one of the main contenders as far as competition for the Beatles is concerned, right? The Beatles and the Beach Boys were in a friendly competition throughout a good part of the 60s, and so we'll explore the creative fruits of those efforts. And then we also want to discuss a bit the hippies and the rise of psychedelia and so on. And we'll talk about that more in later sessions. But the Beach Boys, particularly because of the song Good Vibrations and the unfinished album Smile, they're a good opportunity to start exploring some of those issues. So let's continue. Surf music was in some ways a response to the girl groups in Motown, which many people considered kind of schlocky music. So, at least at first, surf music was meant to be a kind of return to authenticity. We'll see that kind of becomes challenged over the short course of its career, but it really has like I just intimated, it has a kind of short lifespan, only from really 1961 to 64. There are surf songs, of course, that go beyond that. There are some people who still make the occasional surf song or whatever, usually as a kind of nostalgic throwback, but still. But its real lifespan was those few years, 61 to 64. And this is music largely for the white middle class because in those days, surfing was connected more with the white middle class and with white middle class youth in particular. The music is a kind of metaphor for easygoing life and a celebration of consumption. So it's unlike other types of rock and roll. Surf music seems to be fond of capitalism, right? We'll see throughout the course of the semester that some kinds of rock resist capitalism. This is one that celebrates it. It's the first sport to ever have a style of music all of its own, and we want to think about what that might represent, or I want you to think about what that might represent. It started as a largely instrumental genre with Dick Dale, and we'll see a picture of him in a moment. And then later bands such as the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean performed vocal surf music. The lyrics include images of affluence, right? We mentioned capitalism and consumption already. Cars, girls, the beach, and so on. It has a driving, vibrant sound and is kind of a precursor to psychedelic and progressive rock. The guitar and overall production often rely upon a wet spring reverb sound, and you might not know what that means for me just saying wet reverb sound, but when you listen to it, you'll definitely hear the spring reverb. This is partly because of the Fender Reverb unit. It was one of the first highly successful reverb units that the guitarists began to exploit. And this gives it a characteristic timbre that was considered modern and reminiscent of the waves crashing on the shore. So that's one way in which the surf music connects to the surfing sport. Dick Dale developed an alternating picking style, meaning that he's holding the pick in his hand and then going down and up strokes, right? And that allows for a faster tremolo picking on the strings. And you can hear that in his most famous tune, Miserlou. So here's a picture of Jan and Dean, and then over there is Dick Dale, and then a guy surfing, right? I'm curious about this issue of the music for a sport. And it's not easy to determine how this all came about. A lot of the people who the Beach Boys, for instance, only one of the Beach Boys surfed at all. Dick Dale did surf some. I'm not sure about Jan and Dean. And Dick Dale really, in some ways, is the father of the sport. Or father of this music. So it's perhaps appropriate to think about him. He is playing, for the most part, as we'll see, in relatively small nightclubs or bars that are on the beach, and his clientele would have been people who have been out surfing all day, and he's kind of emulating that. And when you listen to that sound, that reverb sound, that echoey sound, like you're caught up in a wave that's curling in on you, like you see there with the surfer, the sound effects of that, are one of the things that's carried forth in the music. The energy, of course. And Dick Dale's music really depends on a great deal of energy, as we'll see. He's using the loudest possible equipment at the time. He's very involved in the development of sound equipment. The effects, and then the overall sound of it, and feel of it, with the kind of tremolo picking is this way of giving it this kind of directional energy, right? Although it's not, it seems directional, but doesn't have to be. After all, you could tremolo pick on the same note forever, and therefore it can be static. But it gives it this sense of motion within stasis. And after all, that's kind of what the ocean is, right? The ocean is an overall static thing that when you zoom in on it and get closer to its surface and its workings, you see that it's not static at all. It's this constant dynamic element, even though it stays within, more or less, within its own confines. So Dick Dale and the Deltones, they're performing in 1961 at the Rendezvous Ballroom in Balboa, California, and they're playing dances mostly, like I said, for surfers, that they're calling stomps. And you can see that they have some horn players, drums, bass, guitar, right? So it's this rhythm section heavy music. The horns are mostly for accentuation, although they sometimes have the melody and so on. He worked with Leo Fender, the creator of the first solid body guitar, to develop amplification, and that was the first 100-watt amp, and we'll see a picture of a model of that in a moment, and reverb equipment. He had a very dedicated local following. His song Let's Go Trippin' was the first surf rock tune, or is considered the first surf rock tune. That's from 1961. And then Miserlou, his most famous, is from 62. He has a Middle Eastern heritage, and so he draws on that quite a bit. He employs Mexican and Middle Eastern influences in the choice of scale tones and so on. So when you listen to Miserlou, you'll hear that it has a pretty interesting scale, right? It's a kind of augmented Phrygian scale. It has, the first scale degree is E to F, right? The first step is from E to F, so that Phrygian half step. But then instead of going up to the G, you go up to the G sharp, and you go from G sharp to A, and then from there it's basically like an A minor scale. So you could think of this as an A harmonic minor scale, because you have all those notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G sharp, right? So it's just the A minor scale, but with the raised leading tone, which is sometimes called the A harmonic scale, but it's centered around E. So that makes it this very sort of strange sound. He gets a contract with Capitol in 1963, but he's already somewhat passé by that point. And like I said, surf music in the strong sense really only lasts for 4 years, and he's already at the end of that. At any rate, here's the amplifier. The Fender. This is a twin reverb amp from the 60s. This isn't the first 100-watt amplifier, but it is one of the early 100-watt amplifiers. It's not the one that was first given to Dick Dale, but it's an improvement on that. It was one of the few where I could find a picture of it where it's actually from the 60s and not a later version of the model. There are probably other pictures out there. I just couldn't find them. But here's the twin reverb. This is a very important amp for anyone who's been a gigging musician. You know that it's a relatively heavy amp by today's standards, but by standards of that time, this was an amp that you could carry around that had a lot of power and was still somewhat portable. And it had a lot of variety of tone and sound, and the reverb could get pretty extremely wet to give you that sound that the surf music seemed to use. There were, of course, several instrumental hits that weren't just by Dick Dale. Wipeout's one of the most famous. I mean, granted, it has that one vocal where they just say Wipeout, ha ha ha, over and over again, but it's basically an instrumental. That's by the Safaris in 63. And then there's Pipeline by the Shantays in 63. Again, you can see that we're hitting a sort of peak in 63, and then the novelty of it all kind of wears out. Now, this all contributes to the California sound and the California myth. In 1963, this is sometimes thought of as the year of the California sound, where some of those elements of surf music are crossing over into what's known as sunshine pop, which is this kind of optimistic pop sound, again with some reverb aspects, often talk about the beach and youth and again, consumption and so on. Many groups coming out of Southern California have an emphasis on carefree attitudes, beach themes, and California is an idyllic, optimistic place. The lyrics focus on the beach and hot rod culture, so fancy cars, youthful innocence and freedom, and the allure of the California girl. So this is about eudaimonism. Eudaimonism is the privileging of fun, that the point of life is to have fun, to enjoy oneself, right? So this is the eudaimonism of fun, the idea that California is the location of a new American ideal. And you can see here in this poster art or billboard art, you have the beach, Hollywood, San Francisco, and the Golden Gate Bridge, all brought together here, right? The Bay. As an advertisement for California. California has a kind of long history in some ways of being the center of dreams and hopes, right? After all, the California gold rush that goes back to the 1800s. And this idea of California as a kind of unsullied land, that it's less connected, it's ever less connected to Europe and the indebtedness to European culture that the East is thought to still have. That when you get out to California, you're further and further removed from that. It's more and more of a wild country, more and more of a way to make you what you are inherently, whatever that might mean. So here's another bit of poster art, I'm pretty sure from the same artist, right? And here you can see the surfboard and the car, and the girls riding California in the sand in their beachwear, and then the girl surfing and so on, and two guys chasing the California girl, right? So this idea of everything celebrating relaxation and fun and an easygoing life, and this idea of kind of lack of responsibility. Of course, I mean, it's not like people living in California didn't have responsibility. They had to pay for the surfboard and the car and the time, but the idea here is that maybe they didn't. Maybe they're privileged youth, and they didn't have to pay for any of it. The parents had to pay for it, right? And you can see this as a theme in several movies of the time, and we'll look at that in a second. And then obviously poster art and music and so on. So Beach Party is the movie I was just alluding to, right? It starts as a kind of apolitical, the beach aesthetic in general is a kind of apolitical cultural phenomenon at first, a celebration of youth pursuing innocent fun, and thus an image of middle-class leisure and attainment, but lacking self-consciousness, and thus purportedly unspoiled, right? So there's this concern, as you probably already know, always with the middle class, that they're seeking leisure time, they're seeking enjoyment, and they want to feel that they've attained that they deserve it, but at the same time, they want to feel that they've attained it without taking advantage of others, without depending on the less paid and more exhausting labor of the lower class. So the middle class is constantly looking for this almost Rousseauian sense of innocence, of being out in a state of nature and enjoyment, without the kind of tribulations of capitalism, without the unfair balance sheet that capitalism puts forth, or that many people see capitalism as putting forth. So the Beach Party movies are a great example of that. They're these celebrations of fun that don't talk about, especially in the early iterations of the film, don't talk about any of those inequalities. There aren't any rich kid, poor kid stories, or at least not as many in the beach party movies. That comes in later, of course. But for the most part, these are people that are having fun without responsibility, other than maybe working at the beach, right? And as a lifeguard, which is a great deal of responsibility, but it doesn't come across as being such in these movies, except for in certain select scenes. So 1963, this is the year of the first of 7 beach party movies. And they star, at least in the early iterations, Annette Funicello, who had to get special permission to even be in a bathing suit from Walt Disney, because she was part of the Mickey Mouse Club prior to this, and was one of Walt Disney's biggest stars. And then Frankie Avalon, the singer and the teen idol that we talked about in the previous session. And then even Dick Dale showed up as a feature performer in one of the films. And the movies created the beach party film genre, which is a genre that still goes on today. There are still beach party films that go by various names. The sound, the Californian sound, was really inaugurated by the Beach Boys in November of '61 with the song Surfin', and we'll talk about that more in a moment. It was soon adopted by many different acts, including Jan and Dean, and Gary Usher, the producer that we see here, and Terry Melcher, who was the producer for the Byrds and other groups, and then the Ripcords, and later acts like the Association, the Cowsills, Fifth Dimension, and Loving Spoonful, rather. Let's talk about Terry Melcher next. This is Terry Melcher. He adopted Brian Wilson's production approach and techniques, from Don't Worry Baby to the Byrds cover of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man. We're going to talk more about Don't Worry Baby in a moment. This launched a new phase of the California sound that was more folk-oriented and often socially engaged, so less about eudaimonism and more about world concerns, right? So you have the Byrds, you have the Turtles, Sonny and Cher, Mamas and Papas, and so on, right? And we'll cover this phase of the California sound when we talk about folk rock, and we'll talk about songs such as Turn, 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 and even Mr. Tambourine Man. While it's these sort of almost stream of consciousness lyrics, it was taken as being, partly because of it having been written by Bob Dylan, as being more socially involved in various ways. So we'll talk about that more in the folk rock session. So the Beach Boys, this was the definitive group, surf group, but they're also a forerunner of psychedelic music. They're also one of the great progenitors of the California sound, pop experimentalism, and progressive rock. So they're a central band in many ways. It was a family affair. They started in 1961 in Hawthorne, California, with Carl Wilson on guitar, and he was the only surfer. And then you had Brian, Dennis, and Carl Wilson. They were the brothers, with the cousin Mike Love. And then they had their friend Al Jardine. They were managed at first by Wilson's father, Murray. And the band was, again, at first called the Pendletones. But in order to sort of cash in on the craze for surfing at the time, they were encouraged to take on the name the Beach Boys, right, to fit that aesthetic of surfing and of the emergent California model of the California aesthetic. Here they are in a sort of playful photograph. You can see they're all wearing matching shirts, and they're kind of well groomed and so on. You can kind of tell the three brothers have very similar facial structures, and that comes out in this photograph as well. And so there's something that sort of carries over from some of the other 60s artists in the American Bandstand kind of aesthetic, although that's more focused on solo singers than bands, and then also the Brill Building and Motown aesthetics. And yet they're going to, partly because they're a band and not run by outside producers, they're going to be a little more experimental, a little more on the cutting edge as they progress. Maybe not quite at first, but as they progress. Let's take a look at some of their songs. So the first one, of course, November 1961, is their first release, and that's Surfin'. They were signed to Candix Records through a publisher friend of Murray's, right? Murray was an amateur songwriter. Well, I guess amateur is not quite the right word. He had songs that he sold, so he was a professional songwriter, but not quite at a super high level. But he had he had friends in the publishing business, and so he wound up being able to wrangle a record deal for his sons through Candix Records. They renamed the boys the Beach Boys because they, but the Beach Boys themselves didn't find out that they had their name changed until the release of the song, right? So they thought they were still going to be listed as the Pendletones. The song comes out as the Beach Boys. That's not atypical, actually, in the independent record companies at the time, or with the independent record companies. They didn't think of anything they were doing as long-standing. Remember, those of you who took my course last semester will remember that one of the worst things that can happen to an independent record company is to have a huge hit group, because then you're not getting paid for the huge hits right away, right? You're not getting paid for anything right away. It's always, you get paid at the end of the month, and a lot of times the retailers will try to stall. So if you have a hit record, then you're having to ship out a whole bunch of pressings before you've gotten paid for the old pressings in order to keep up with demand, and it'll sink you, right? You'll wind up going bankrupt. So a lot of these record companies, what they're really looking for is for a few minor hits of bands they don't care that much about. So yeah, they'll change the name of the band just to try to see if that drums up some business, right? Now, the Beach Boys do wind up taking off, as we'll see. So Surfin' becomes a strong regional hit. So it does pretty much what Candix would have wanted it to do. It makes it to 75 on the National Billboard Hot 100. For a regional hit, that's a really strong showing. And here you have it, right? Candix has what happened to them, what they would rather not have had happen. The demand was so high that it bankrupts Candix. They had to put out too much product without getting paid by the various record companies. And so Candix folds. And the Beach Boys sign a 7-year contract with Capitol Records, which is a major record label at this point, and therefore able to withstand their popularity. On June 4th of 1962, they release Surfin' Safari. The B-side of that is 409, another somewhat famous song now. And this is their first single on Capitol Records. It reaches number 14 on the Billboard Pop charts. And it leads to their first album, which is also called Surfin' Safari, which gets released a few months later in October. The album's mostly original music, which is not typical for the early 60s. In the early 60s, a lot of what you're doing are tunes written by other producers and songwriters, some of which have already been minor hits or whatever. But pretty much the Beach Boys, they're writing their own music pretty much from the start. They didn't emphasize on this album the instrumentals and the spring reverb so characteristic of most surf music. So they're already moving away from surf music, and that's why some people resist calling the Beach Boys a surf music band, because they sort of dabble in it. It's one of the many things that they draw upon, but they don't really emphasize it in the way that, say, Dick Dale did. And this leads some listeners to think of them as posers, right? That's not really what they're not really about that at all. They're just sort of drawing on it to gain some cheap popularity, but it's not really their main form of expression. Other people will think that, well, it's not that they're posers so much as that they're drawing on it as one of many styles. Let's keep moving. On January of 1963, they have their first top 10 hit with Surfin' USA. Now, in one sense, this is an original song. All the words are new. But basically, the melody, with a few alterations, and certainly the sound and the The chord progression, I mean, the chord progression is basically a modification of the blues, but still, the way that it's being performed, the feel of it, the exact sound of the guitar, and the way that the guitar is being performed, all of this is basically copped from Chuck Berry. This is, of course, 1963, the year of the California sound and the rise of the California myth. And so Brian Wilson's contributing to that through the song. And he will eventually get sued by Chuck Berry for copyright infringement. And Chuck Berry wins. And what he does is he gets his name added as there's a financial settlement, but he gets his name added as an author, as one of the primary authors of the song, and therefore he gets cuts of the residuals as the song sells. It contributes. He gets a check for that. Brian Wilson on this album, he double tracks all of the vocals on the song and throughout most of that album to create this huge sound. Remember, I mean, they're all singing, contributing to the singing. So you double track each of the voices, you get this huge, almost choral-like sound, which of course connects it to sort of light classical music. It also connects it to collegial groups. It makes it recognizable and yet at the same time new sound within pop music of this sort. The album Surfin' USA is released in March, and it reaches number 2 on the Billboard album charts. During this year, Brian was under the spell of Phil Spector, and he attended some of the sessions at Gold Star, and he becomes so obsessed with the song Be My Baby, which we've already talked about in some detail, that he really wants to capture some of that sound. He really studies it. His daughter says that every morning she would wake up and hear boom, da boom, boom, right? That was basically his morning coffee, was listening to Be My Baby and really studying it. And he claims that it was this song that led him to really think like a producer instead of a songwriter, and that he now considered the recording to take precedence over the song. And just like we saw with the Beatles, there's this move, and it's happening a little earlier, I guess, with the Beach Boys, but it's this move in the mid-60s toward the studio as this realm of experimentation, of creating these sort of pop gems. Now, Phil Spector's already thinking that way in the very early 60s, and late 50s, early 60s. But it's this idea that the single at first is this little miniature symphony, this little work of art. And then soon with the Beach Boys and the Beatles, it'll be the full album that is the work of art. The album Surfer Girl was released in September of 63. And that was the first to use outside musicians, members of the Wrecking Crew, the Phil Spector group. So therefore the touring group, the actual Beach Boys, were going to be featured less and less in coming recordings, aside from their voices. So they're not, Brian Wilson doesn't think of them as being good enough to play on the records anymore. So now Brian Wilson is the main writer, he's the arranger, he's the producer. He's getting the music done. And then they go out and they tour with it. And he doesn't even always join them on tour, as we'll see. In 1964, of course, is the British invasion, and then it effectively ends surf rock. The Beatles are on Capitol Records in the U.S. They're on EMI, of course, but EMI and Capitol have, I can't remember who owns which. I think EMI owns Capitol. At any rate, so they're in direct competition now, the Beach Boys and the Beatles. Brian Wilson wanted to keep up with the Beatles. He was obsessed with this, and soon Paul McCartney becomes very interested in the Beatles and wanting to keep up with them, right? So there's this friendly but pretty intense competition between the two groups. In April, they fire Murray as their manager for various reasons. He's not a great manager. He also wasn't apparently such a great father. He was abusive to Brian Wilson in particular. So they fire Murray. And they record I Get Around. And that's, in some ways, their most impressive recording of this first phase. It has dense, complex harmonies. It's their first number one. It really is a gem of a recording. The B-side is Don't Worry Baby, and thus you're pairing I Get Around with its sort of sunshine eudaimonism with a darker, more pensive and troubling rumination on hubris and possibly loss in Don't Worry Baby, right? It's written from the point of view of a woman consoling the songwriter, Brian Wilson, telling him to not worry, that things will be all right. Both of them are really interesting harmonically and are worth really thinking about in some detail for the way they work as pieces of music. Now, we're going to take a break from the Beach Boys and return to them in a moment to get a sense of some of the countercultural aspects of the 1960s. When we talked about the Beatles, we talked about Camelot and the end of Camelot with the JFK's assassination, and we talked about some of the books and those kind of cultural underpinnings of the 60s. But right now I want to focus solely on the countercultural aspect of things. The 60s was an era, as you know, of great prosperity among the middle class. White teenagers and young people in their 20s had grown up in affluence, owing to the general wealth and security of post-World War II U.S. They were also rather too young to be overly influenced by the cynicism arising from the early Cold War years and the Red Scare and McCarthyism of the period from roughly 47 to 54. But two major issues disrupt their sense of security. First is, of course, the civil rights movement, which is moving into a more prominent and honestly bloodier phase in the 60s. So it already had moved into a more prominent phase in December of 55 when Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on the bus launched the Montgomery bus boycott, and that culminated in the November 1966 Supreme Court desegregation of buses. And then, of course, when you get into the 60s, you have the Voting Rights Act and all that, the major legislation fostered by Lyndon B. Johnson. But so by the time you get in the 60s, the civil rights movement is fracturing and it's becoming something more militaristic to some extent, or at least in some circles. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, the second major influence on or disruption of security in the 60s is the Vietnam War, which began in 55, but it really escalated and became a major concern as the war escalated under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. The draft, which was in place during the Korean War as well, but didn't lead to the same amount of protests because it didn't lead to the same amount of numbers. The draft became seen as a major threat to American men without necessity. Many people felt there was no need to be in Vietnam, and therefore you were just sending off young people to die for what was seen as really a corrupt war, a war that was more about capitalism and power than it was about our U.S. national security. So the three countercultural movements that arise in response to these disruptions are the civil rights movement, which in the 60s becomes increasingly widespread and racially diverse. It also splits between the Martin Luther King-led wing seeking assimilation and accommodation. And as we said already with Martin Luther King, he's even becoming somewhat skeptical of assimilation at this period. So it moves from what some historians call a period of assimilation to a period of accommodation. That it's no longer about blacks becoming like whites and therefore assimilated into white culture, but rather finding some kind of accommodation that will create equality without sacrifice of culture and of heritage. And then on the other hand, you have the Black Panther-inspired wing, which is seeking separation, often separation within. So this idea of black-run communities with a black police force, black businesses, black government, and so on within the U.S. So not leaving the U.S., but separation within. And then independence. The Black Panther movement is, of course, a very interesting one in a lot of ways. They start off as a sort of self-protection group. They're interested in policing the police, right? So they're operating in areas where open carry laws are in place, so they are perfectly within their legal rights to carry the guns that they're carrying. You can see they wear sort of these uniforms with the berets and the leather jackets and the buttons, right? so that they're instantly recognizable, and they often are traveling in groups. And the idea is to, I guess, intimidate, or at least mildly intimidate, the police who are operating in black neighborhoods, so as to watch them. They call it cop watching, right? They're observing to make sure that they're not engaging in police brutality and so on. And there's always the threat of violence, and at times, the Black Panthers became actually violent. For the most part, that gets exaggerated, but there were times where there was violence. Usually it was a result of responding to the various types of infiltration that they had to resist on the part of especially the Nixon administration. And we'll talk about this in some more detail later. Then you have the New Left, right? They pursued several social justice causes, including civil rights, feminism, gay rights, abortion rights, drug policy reform, free speech, and refurbished gender roles. So, for instance, it's during this time. We're leading to the time where the term Ms. becomes more commonplace, right? They rejected the Marxist theory of class struggle, and they were inspired by the Frankfurt School, Marcuse especially, in order to worry really about the logic of capitalism, and that it had made human beings into commercial products, lacking intrinsic worth. So rejected is a little bit strong. The idea here is that they don't believe in the part of Marxist theory that suggests that the middle class is always going to be pitted against the proletarian. And that the middle class is therefore the petit bourgeois, they're part of the problem, and then that it's only the lower class rising that will lead to the betterment of society. They reject that part of Marxism, because obviously most of the people in the New Left are from the middle class, so they want to see themselves as the agents of social change. But they are very skeptical of capitalism. So they're concerned not with capitalism in the sense that capitalism leads to free enterprise and the ideology of free enterprise. They don't want to dismantle capitalism entirely. They don't want to become victims of capitalism. Well, at least most of the New Left doesn't want to dismantle capitalism entirely. They want what we now think of as democratic socialism. They want a government that's looking out for people, but they also don't want a government or a system, the system of capitalism, that's making them into these kind of commercial products. And like I said, you'll hear this more in my discussion of the Grateful Dead and Marcuse, so you'll get more detail on this then. But it's this idea that capitalism isn't just about us having access to products, but rather turning us into kind of products where we lack intrinsic worth, where we become increasingly homogenous and homogenized, and so on. And then third, you have the hippies, right? So you have the new version of the civil rights movement, you have the New Left, and then you have the hippies. And the hippies are a kind of optimistic alternative to the cynicism of the Beat Generation. They're not, at least at first, as politically driven as the New Left. They're not out, for the most part. There were, of course, anti-Vietnam protests that they engaged in. But for the most part, their idea is to not be as involved as political actors, right? They're not trying to change government. They're trying to sort of leave it behind. They sought a spiritual means of infusing meaning back into American life, which they really saw as a sellout, a drab non-existence, right? They idolized alternative approaches to consciousness, so Eastern philosophies, the eschewal of political engagement, dropping out of the political scene, drugs as a tool for expanding consciousness, and then communal interdependence, while still considering each member a unique individual. So they were interested in these communes. And communes is, at least as far as history seems to show, they only work in relatively small numbers, right? So they're not looking for communism as a form of government. They're looking for communism as a way of living together in these small communes, right? So dropping out of the bigger picture, which is why they're often labeled as being lazy because they don't have traditional jobs, but they're not lazy at all. They're looking for ways of conducting a life and of building a life that isn't dependent upon capitalism directly, that isn't dependent upon, although it may be indirectly dependent upon it, obviously, because they, for instance, the communes that are working as farms, they have machinery that was made in factories and that they bought in stores, and so therefore they're indirectly participating in, or directly to an extent participating in capitalism. But then the idea is to take that material and then live off the land, work the land, and with each other to create as close to an independent existence as they can. All three movements were pro-civil rights and anti-Vietnam War, but for different reasons and with different approaches to those concerns. So you have legal reform on the part of civil rights and on the part of the New Left, and then you have the shifts in consciousness, which also applies to elements of the civil rights, right? The Black Panthers were very interested in educational programs. They were very interested in this shift in the way that blacks understood themselves. And then, of course, the hippies were more emphatic with respect to shifts in consciousness than political agitation. Now, the Beach Boys, as we'll see, become increasingly embroiled in these concerns and issues. So let's pick them up again with their move into this idea of the album as art, which we saw was happening around the same time with the Beatles, with Revolver and Rubber Soul, and then especially once we get to Sgt. Pepper's. In 1965, in January of 65, Brian decides to no longer tour with the band at all, and he focuses entirely on writing and producing. He's interested in the burgeoning hip scene, which is the LA version of the San Francisco hippies, right? It's a little more streetwise in a sense, a little less about communes because they're still in LA. He takes marijuana and LSD, and this causes some problems with the other Beach Boys. The others aren't as interested in drugs, and they become suspicious of his involvement in this culture. Some of them will get more involved in drugs as they go, like Carl, for instance. In March, they release the Beach Boys Today album, and he considers it his first album as artwork, where the whole thing is meant to have a sort of album-wide feel, right? So side one is all up-tempo and side two is all ballads. It's not maybe the smartest way in some ways to create an album, although I don't know. I guess if you're in the mood to just keep with the up-tempo stuff, then you have side one, and if you're in the mood to just keep with the ballads, you have side two. So Brian develops what he calls feels, right? Basically what he's doing is he's creating these grooves, these segments of songs that can last however long with as many repetitions, and then he assembles them into songs. So he's putting various feels together into songs. So he's no longer touring with the group, and the group no longer records anything but the vocals. So you really have a separation here between the creative aspect of things and the performance aspect of things. Performance here meaning live performance, right? The performance on record is part of the creative domain of Brian Wilson, and he really sees it that way. He's not interested in who plays the bass. He wants the best, as far as it being a part of the identifier of the band. He wants whoever plays the bass best for this recording, right? So if it's a recording that's meant to be particularly a melodic bass line, even though he's a good bass player, he might have someone else play it if he feels like they do a better job with that kind of thing. Although melodic bass playing is actually his ballywick. He's particularly good at that. But at any rate, the idea is he's going to find the best player for this track. So it's all about the track. It's all about the creativity behind this sound. In January of 1966, in answer to the Beatles' Rubber Soul, Wilson begins recording Pet Sounds. right? He sees Rubber Soul as basically a provocation in some ways. He wants to answer it. And what he does with Pet Sounds is really some of the most advanced studio techniques of that time. He hires Derek Taylor, who was previously working as the press officer for the Beatles, as the Beach Boys publicist, and Derek Taylor launches an ad campaign declaring Brian Wilson as a genius. So this idea of Brian Wilson as a kind of almost Wagnerian composer, producer, artist, that becomes part of their brand, right? And this is pretty bold. This isn't anything that even Phil Spector had done, where you're advertising him as a genius. Of course, there's a certain amount of hubris there, and Brian Wilson himself was kind of not too fond of this campaign. But Derek Taylor thought that really, now that the Beach Boys were becoming a studio-oriented, art form inspired band, right, that he really needed a face for that, and that Brian Wilson was that face. And Derek Taylor really did believe that Brian Wilson was a genius. This wasn't just ad copy for him. He really believed he was a genius, and that by promoting that aspect of it, people would listen in a different way. You don't just dance to the music of a genius. You pay attention, right? And so this was part of a way of shifting the attention one gives to these albums, not just a way of drawing up business. So only Sloop John B becomes a hit from the album. All the other songs are now considered true classics, but they weren't hits at the time. And, listen carefully to this album. I mean, Caroline Knows on it. There are all these amazing songs on this album, and yet they're not from that time. They're not hits. But now they're considered, of course, true classics. So the other members of the band didn't perform on any of the instrumental tracks. They came off tour to find it completed, and they were somewhat angry. Right? They objected to this new direction. They thought they should have more creative input, and Brian Wilson didn't understand why they even thought that, really. And they did what he said for this album, and it is truly an amazing album, but because it wasn't the hit on the level of the other albums, they panicked, and Capitol panics because the sales weren't as high, particularly with young women. They are tracing those demographics, and Capitol was panicking. So they released the first Best Of album by the Beach Boys, and this reinvigorates interest, and it recoups some of the phenomenal cost of that album, which was $70,000, equivalent to $550,000 today, and then Good Vibrations, which they spent almost as much on just Good Vibrations as they spent on Pet Sounds. Good Vibrations also not on the album. And Good Vibrations was meant to be the standalone single that was in some ways the most experimental thing that Brian Wilson had done to that point. So all told, Capitol Records had spent $120,000 on the Beach Boys. So they're recouping it through Best Of albums, and that becomes a strategy for a little while for Capitol Records. Good Vibrations was the main project for Brian Wilson during the summer of '66. The song is entirely assembled from feels, right? Or these pet sounds, whatever you want to call them. Feels is what he called them. And then spliced together in the manner of a mosaic. So one of the questions that should come up for you, and that will come up for you on the midterm, as a possible question for you to answer, is this a coherent whole? And if so, how? These are songs that were this is a song that was composed of feels of these sections that had nothing to do with each other. They were written at separate times. They're put together in this almost Frankensteinian fashion, right? The seams are partially hidden by the extreme use of reverb to saturate portions of the tune. The jumps from section to section emphasize the shifts in tempo, texture, emotional feel, and key, right? So these are pieces that are in different keys, have different feels, different textures, different tempos. The sessions lasted for several months. Most pop singles were recorded within 2 hours, but the sessions for this one song, several months, some of which started in February. And then the final sessions ended in September. And they involved 4 different studios and many different musicians. Some of the bass line begins by one bass player and ends by another through overdubs, right? So you have 90 minutes of tape that were used. The subject is vibrations in the sense of extrasensory perception. So it's very much part of the hip scene in LA, the LA version of the hippies. Derek Taylor dubbed it a pocket symphony, right, in the manner of the teenage symphonies of Phil Spector. The orchestration employs organ, jaw harp, electro-theremin, and cello, among many other instruments. Brian regarded it as his challenge to the Beatles, which they then met with Sgt. Pepper's, and especially the song A Day in the Life. And it was also a response to Phil Spector's You've Lost That Lovin' Feeling. The song reached #1 in December, so this was a hit for them. And it was their third #1 after Help Me Rhonda and I Get Around, and it soon became their first million-selling tune. And it is a remarkable tune, and I want you to spend some time listening to it carefully. So I've broken it down into timings, right? So roughly the first minute and a half, or minute and 40 seconds, that's the verse and refrains. The verse is in E flat minor, and the chord progression is what is sometimes called the Andalusian cadence. It's just the E flat minor going down to the flat 7 chord, so D flat major, to the flat 6, so C flat major, right, to the 5 chord, which is B flat major. This is the Andalusian cadence because it's a very typical chord progression used in flamenco music. If you play through it on the guitar or piano, you'll hear that it sounds like flamenco music in some ways. It doesn't so much on this track because of the way they stretch it out and the things they do to it. This section features a Hammond organ through a Leslie cabinet. That's a revolving cabinet system. Gives it that kind of very specific kind of reverb or kind of an interrupting pattern. And then bass. There's a flute choir, 2 piccolos playing chords, and the descending flute line are added. There's a brief D-flat chord that serves as an applied dominant at the end of this that allows the refrain to move to G-flat major. And in the G-flat major section, that's the chorus. With the string bass and the cello appearing and the driving triplets. The refrain builds its vocal texture with each iteration, and it also rises by whole steps so that we go from G flat to A flat to B flat, and then the B flat serves as the 5 to get us back to E flat minor. So that's a pretty interesting progression in general. In some ways it's very standard. You have the E flat movement to G flat, and that's just moving from the relative minor to the relative major. So that's not a big deal. But the way that he does it is by having each of those areas be fairly self-consistent. Well, actually, the E flat is more self-consistent than the G flat area. The E flat area with its Andalusian chorus could just keep repeating because you're just going down to the dominant. It's just a linear progression getting us from the E flat to the B flat, so the tonic to the dominant that can then repeat. But by inserting that D flat chord in there, he moves us to G flat, the relative major. But the G flat section is not self-contained. It doesn't have a self-contained chord progression. Instead, it just rises by half step or by whole step to get us to the B flat that can then loop us back around to the verse. But it also makes that refrain a little less coherent in some ways. It makes it so that you're just amping up the energy each time. Part 2 runs from a minute and 40 to 2 and 13 seconds, 2 minutes and 13 seconds, and that's episode 1. This is the first marked tape splice. You can hear it. We jump into a whole new sound world. The B flat is now simply assumed as the new tonic. Remember, it was the dominant. And the progression oscillates between B flat and E flat, so 1 and 4. Now you hear the tack piano, piano with a bunch of tacks on it to sound kind of like a ragtimey piano. And then the jaw harp, and the bass harmonica appears toward the end along with sleigh bells, right? So a whole change in sound, change in emotional feel. It feels like it comes out of nowhere in some ways. Then you get episode 2. So instead of going back to everything, you go right to a new episode. It's another tape splice. and you go to a whole new field. Now we're in F major, so we've jumped up a fifth from the B flat major where we were, and the chord progression is 1-2-5, right? With a section that reduces the intensity of the recording. So instead of continuing to amp up the energy, we're now having this kind of break in the middle of everything. There's a harmonica solo, and you feel like you're reaching a kind of concluding fade out. Indeed, there's a 5-part whole tone chord that ends the section instead of a fade out. And then we move into, after this sort of echoing silence, we move back into a new section. And that's part 4. Part 4 goes from 257 to 335, and that's the retro refrain and coda. The refrain now descends. That's why I'm calling it a retro refrain. Instead of going up, G flat, A flat, B flat, now we're coming down, B flat, A flat, G flat. There's a complex bit of counterpoint that's used as the coda, which also reverses direction and then ascends, goes back up to the B flat. So we have all this harmonic movement, but within each of those levels, there's a great deal of stasis. You're not doing a whole lot, right? The most directed chord progression we have in the entire piece is the verse. The chorus, the refrain is static. You're just on G flat, then you go up to A flat, then you go up to B flat. But within each of those levels, it's static. The episode 1, which is part 2 of the song, is just alternating between B flat and E flat chords. Episode 2 is basically sticking around F major, right? So most of the tune are these static elements that are then being juxtaposed in order to get the dynamic elements of the tune. So the question remains, and I want you to think about this. Is this a kind of Frankensteinian monster that's just put together through various parts that really aren't related together? So there's no organic whole. It's just this kind of mishmash of things. Or does there wind up being this greater sense of good vibrations as a whole, where the parts do connect, even though they literally don't? I mean, you hear the tape splices, so you can easily make a good case for this not being a coherent whole. The harder thing, I think, is to argue for it being a coherent whole, and yet it's sold well as a song as a whole. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a whole. That could mean that it's sold well because it's kind of medley, right? Medleys aren't really wholes. They're a bunch of different parts that are connected together in sometimes clever ways. So what is the aesthetic aspect of this tune? What is its aesthetic identity? Is it a whole? Is it a medley, a collection of pieces? In one sense, you could say, well, does it matter? It was successful anyway. No, but it does matter in how we understand it as a work of art, and he's clearly wanting us to hear this as a work of art. So you might think of it in the way that some artists have triptychs, where they have 3 paintings, and those triptychs sometimes go together, where it's clearly one painting divided into 3, and sometimes they don't, where it's 3 paintings that are put together in some nice arrangement, but that don't necessarily connect in any stronger sense, right? There are a series of ways you might consider this piece of music, and I want you to think about that. Here's Derek Taylor, the great promoter and the great believer in Brian Wilson, and Brian Wilson then is starting now to create a concept album that is going to be in response to Sgt. Pepper's. He's keeping up his competition with the Beatles. It's going to be called Smile, with lyrics by the poet Van Dyke Parks. It's truly bizarre. Brian met Parks while working on Good Vibrations. He had asked Parks to write the lyrics, but Parks refused to write the lyrics for that particular tune. Brian planned this album to be a coherent suite of songs with certain melodies, phrases, and instrumental parts reappearing in different songs. So he really wanted it to be kind of like almost like a Wagnerian opera or a late 19th century symphony, where parts, melodies, and motives keep coming back. And he wanted to build on the recording techniques and the psychedelia of Good Vibrations, which he now regarded as an entirely new direction in music. He thought he was really leading somewhere new. He saw it as the definitive American answer to the influx of British influence in popular music. Derek Taylor began writing anonymous letters to the press in order to keep the conversation about the album and interest in it alive. Because, of course, once again, Brian Wilson is taking a lot of time in the studio. He's not going to just pump this thing out. He's working on it over the course of many, many sessions. And some of the sessions he doesn't even regard as real recording sessions. They're just experimental sessions. And you can hear this, by the way. All those things are released, and you can collect them and listen to them. And they're amazing to listen to. Just the work that he's putting into this thing. The album was supposed to incorporate cowboy songs, chanting, cartoon sound effects, classical music, Indian and Hawaiian sounds, musique concrète, which is the manipulation of tape, jazz, yodeling. By December of 66, he had completed most of the instrumental backing tracks, and like I said, you can hear these. The band thought that the songs were far too removed from the commercial aspect of their previous music. And so delays ensued. They argued a lot. Eventually, the project was shelved, and Brian had a nervous breakdown. He withdrew more and more from the group and went through long bouts of drug abuse and overeating. The band was scheduled to headline the Monterey Pop Festival, but they had to back out. Many people considered this their fall from grace and their realization that they couldn't keep up with the new music. Jimi Hendrix even chided their single Heroes and Villains, which is a great song and was meant to be one of the highlights of the Smile album. He chided it as psychedelic music by a barbershop quartet. So now some of the things that had made them popular in the earlier 60s are now seen to be to their detriment, and they're really falling away from the scene. Carl Wilson takes over as the group's leader from this point and throughout the 70s. Brian continues to work in the studio, and he continues to pursue some experimentation, but those are sort of the off tracks on the album. They're some of the best tracks, but the band really goes toward being more of a throwback during the 70s, or perhaps even a sellout. They toured extensively, made much more on their tours than they did through their albums, and they're being regarded more and more as a kind of throwback, a nostalgia group. They release a slew of best of albums, right? They really make most of their money in the 70s and 80s from best of albums. So they become kind of an oldies group, maybe even before their time. But for a brief period of time there, especially those albums surrounding Pet Sounds, the couple albums before, and then of course the Smile sessions, and of course later Brian Wilson does release Smile. He finishes Smile. You can hear both the Smile sessions, the unfinished works, which are amazing to listen to, I think, and then he, when he went back and finished it, it is something. It's not the same kind of something it would have been had it been released in the 60s, but it is something, and it's amazing to listen to. That's it for this session. I'll see you at the next one.